knows about a man called Martin Luther King Jr. He was a pastor and one of the most prominent civil rights leaders in the 50s and 60s. In his speeches and demonstrations, he inspired thousands to take a stand for the equal treatment of black people. And because of his efforts and the efforts of others, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed, dealing a major blow to racial segregation and other forms of discrimination and racism. And although he was assassinated long ago, most people still remember him today and regard him as a hero, a champion of civil rights. But before Martin Luther King Jr., there was Martin Luther King Sr. The senior king also grew up in the church and became a minister. During the time of the Great Depression, the finances of the church were not looking very good. But through organizing fundraisers and other events, the church became stable once again, and he became known as a respected leader in his community. He also stubbornly opposed any kind of racism that was shown to him, even talking back to police officers who tried to belittle him. Later, Martin Luther King Jr. recalled his father saying, "I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it." And MLK Jr. spoke several times about the influence his father had on him, both in his call to ministry and in his call to civil rights activism. It is no secret that we influence and pass on things to the people who come after us. Our parents, our grandparents, our teachers, our coaches, our church leaders, and our mentors all play extremely influential parts in our lives. And they can influence our future behavior for years to come. Like the kings, we can instill passions, ideals, values, and skills into those who admire and follow us. But unfortunately, this works both for good and for ill. After all, the racism that the kings Jr. and Sr. fought against didn't emerge overnight. It took someone with the idea that people of a different skin color were lesser, passing it on to others and to their children. And generations upon generations of people perpetuated these ideas, continuing the cycle of sin, each new generation passing it on to the next. And that's why we call it generational sin. For those of you that are just joining us, we've spent the last several weeks going through the book of Judges. Israel had conquered the land that God had promised to them and established themselves there. They were now an independent nation, but despite this, they had no formal hierarchy or leadership. They had the rules and practices that God had given them, but they proved to be pretty bad at following them. They got themselves trapped in a kind of a cycle. People do evil in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord punishes them, or perhaps declines to prevent, the invasion of Israel by other nations. Israel cries out to God after experiencing the oppression of the ruling nation. God raises up a leader called a judge to rescue and lead them. And then once the judge dies, the people again return to doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. On and on and on. But with each new cycle, the people got just a little bit worse. They forgot the Lord quicker and more fully. They worshiped idols more fervently with more questionable practices. And their morals declined more sharply. The earlier judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, and Barak, were exceptional. Some of them showed a little bit of a lack of faith here and there, some missteps, but they were always faithful to God, and they always led their people back to the Lord. But as the generational sins continued to be passed down, despite the efforts of the earlier judges, they began to affect the people more severely. And with all the potential leaders growing up with these generational sins, they too got worse with each cycle. Last week we finished the story of Gideon, who was largely considered the turning point in the judge's narrative. He was still mostly faithful to God throughout his life, and he still exhibited admirable qualities, but his story is also marred with bad choices and questionable motives. He was initially hesitant to be a military leader, but then he was perfectly willing to massacre the Israelite towns who refused to give him aid. He was faithful to God and had once torn down an altar to the Canaanite god known as Baal, but then he created an ephod made of gold, which became an idol and object of worship that led the people astray. He refused to be named king because only God was their king, but he spent the rest of his life living and acting like one. And while Gideon had done God's will and delivered Israel from its oppressors, the more negative aspects of his time as a judge rubbed off on the next generation of Israelites, especially with his son, Abimelek. Now, obviously, the people returned to worshiping other gods as soon as Gideon had died. Perhaps they even started a little before he died because of the golden ephod. But let's be honest, they had gone back to idol worship every time a previous judge had died. So regardless of Gideon's actions, I don't think it's fair to blame him entirely. It was probably going to happen anyway. But the cycle of judges gets a little bit messier this time. See, while Gideon had been called by God to lead as a judge, and had refused to become an Israelite king, at least in name, his son Abimelek did not share these reservations. With Gideon having been viewed as at least a semi-kingly leader, and with 70 sort of heirs, there was bound to be some kind of infighting or conflict over power when he died. Abimelek was born to a poor concubine from the city of Shechem, and with his relatively low status in society, the other 69 heirs likely thought very little of him. But Abimelek had ambitions. So he made an appeal to the other people of Shechem, saying that not only would it be better to have only one king rather than 70, but he was also one of them. So the people of Shechem gave him enough money to hire a band of thugs. And with these thugs, he attacked his father's home, capturing and executing all the rest of his half-brothers. And the Shechemites supported him in this. In one fell swoop, all of Gideon's children were killed. That's quite a way to treat your former leader, huh? I mean, Gideon made some mistakes with God, but he still took it upon himself to deliver these people from their suffering. He had led them for 40 years, and they had benefited from his leadership. And yet, as soon as he died, they allowed, perhaps even compelled, Abimelek to destroy his legacy and his family. And all so they could have one ruler from their own community. But as with a lot of attempts to wipe out a large royal family, one of Gideon's sons escaped. And as the citizens of Shechem are gathering to crown Abimelek as king, that lone survivor, known as Jotham, climbed to the top of a nearby mountain and began to speak. Apparently the acoustics on that mountain were very good, and they carried his voice down to the people below, even as he stood a safe distance away from them. And in Judges chapter 9, verses 8 through 15, Jotham relates a story to them. One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree answered, "Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and humans are honored, to hold sway over the trees?" Next the trees said to the fig tree, "Come and be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" And then the trees said to the vine, "Come and be our king." But the vine answered, "Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and humans, to hold sway over the trees?" Finally, all the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." The thorn bush said to the trees, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon." Israel had plenty of good leaders before. All of the previous judges included Gideon, for example. Olive trees, fig trees, and vines all produced good fruit and were a benefit to those around them. But because they were good leaders, too busy doing their good deeds and also recognizing that only God was the true king, they refused to be the kings themselves. So instead, the people asked the thorn bush, a plant that was detrimental to all. Its thorns scratched and scraped those who came into contact with it. It produced nothing that could be used or of benefit. And above all, it was known for its ability to quickly catch fire and burn the surrounding land. And because the thorn bush had nothing else going for it and was not good enough to recognize God's position, the thorn bush accepted. The people wanted a king so badly that they overlooked the good qualities necessary for leadership, and they dishonored the legacy of a good leader to make it happen. And so Jotham curses the people, saying because they had killed Gideon's descendants, the king that they chose would bring fire to them, and they would bring fire to the king. And sure enough, it only took 3 years for things to start reaching their boiling point. Many of the people who had once supported Abimelek grew dissatisfied with his rule. Some of the people from Shechem began ambushing caravans, stealing their goods and robbing Abimelek of the revenue he would have gotten from their commerce. And soon thereafter, during a Canaanite festival that was being celebrated in the city, a man drunkenly began insulting Abimelek and stirring up a revolt. But before they could organize a rebellion, the governor of the city informed Abimelek of what was happening. And so Abimelek ambushed them, and the rebellion was easily defeated. And you would think that would be the end of it, yeah? Rebellion shut down and finished. All of the people stirring up trouble were defeated. However, Abimelek was not satisfied with their punishment. The next morning, when the other people of Shechem came out to resume their farming and other regular activities, Abimelek attacked, massacring the entire population. He captured and killed nearly everyone in the city, but as he was finishing up, he found the remaining Shechemites taking refuge in the stronghold of a temple dedicated to the Canaanite god Baal. So Abimelek and his army set it on fire with all of the people still inside. All 1,000 of them perished in the fire. But Abimelek still wasn't done. After he finished in Shechem, he moved northeast to the city of Thebez, where apparently his rule was also unpopular. And he began massacring everyone there as well. And when the people took refuge in the nearby tower, Abimelek tried to set fire to it too, just as he had in Shechem. But as Abimelek approached the tower to set it ablaze, a woman at the roof of the tower hurled a millstone down at him, and miraculously it struck him right in the head, mortally wounding him. Abimelek, with his skull cracked, stumbled over to his armor-bearer and asked to be slain, so that it could not be said that he was killed by a woman. And so the armor-bearer ran him through with a sword. So ends the reign of Israel's first ever king. That story sure has a lot less positives than last week, huh? How did this happen? The first ever king of God's chosen people, lasting only 3 years. And it was as chaotic and tyrannical and violent as all the other nations of the world. But this didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't just a perfect storm of bad circumstances. We see evidence of these things long before they happen. And these generational sins were passed down, both from Gideon to Abimelek, and from previous generations of Israelites to the next. As has been the case since almost the beginning of the book of Judges, the Israelites were prone to worshiping idols and other gods. And each time a judge died, they would return to idol worship. You may recall that Gideon had torn down the altar to Baal at the beginning of his story, and it helped lead the people back to the Lord when they realized that Baal couldn't prevent it or even punish Gideon for for destroying his altar. But after freeing Israel, Gideon also created an idol that both Abimelek and the others would have worshipped. The generational sin of idolatry was passed on from Gideon to Abimelek and from the previous generation of Israelites to the next. Only this time, the faithfulness of Gideon was not passed on. And because of this generational sin, they forgot that the Lord was their king and sought a king in Abimelek. They desecrated the legacy of God's chosen judge and made king a man whom God had not chosen. And when that same king attacked, they hid in buildings dedicated to Baal, who could not protect them. Generational sin, gone unconfronted, sent the people to ruin. As had been the case before Gideon, the Israelites and their leaders were prone to abusing and misplacing power. The people had forgotten God as their king and had asked Gideon to be king. Gideon had refused, but he lived as if he was one. And so when the people again forgot God as their king, they again asked for a human king. And whereas Gideon had refused, his kingly lifestyle was passed on to Abimelek, and Abimelek sought the throne. The generational sin of power was passed on from Gideon to Abimelek, and from previous generations of Israelites to the next. Only this time, the humility of Gideon was not passed on. And because of this generational sin, Abimelek sought the throne, even killing his family to gain it. The Shechemites crowned him despite his lack of leadership qualities. And when they were dissatisfied with Abimelek, they sought to rebel so they might crown a new king. Generational sin, gone unconfronted, sent the people to ruin. And as had been the case long before, the Israelites were, and some of their leaders were prone to violence and wrath. Gideon had initially been hesitant to fight or go to war when God had called, but he eventually did as God asked, so that he might save Israel. But later on, he had sought vengeance from his own people, far surpassing their crimes and mistakes. And when Abimelek became king, he continued in this seeking of violence. The generational sin of wrath was passed on from Gideon to Abimelek, and from the previous generations of Israelites to the next. Only this time, the hesitancy of Gideon was not passed on. And because of this generational sin, Abimelek and the Shechemites resorted to the murder of 70 innocent people for their own selfishness. When they grew tired of Abimelek, they raided caravans to hinder him and raised an army to kill him. When they were defeated, Abimelek massacred thousands of innocent people in gruesome ways as revenge. And in the end, this violence led to their mutual destruction. Generational sin, gone unconfronted, sent the people to ruin. We as Christians must ask ourselves some very important questions. What is our legacy? How will we be remembered? What virtues and practices are we really passing on? Whether we mostly keep to ourselves or if we're incredibly involved in other people's lives, we all serve as Christian examples. New or questioning Christians, our children and grandchildren, our friends and our family, they all look to us to learn what it means to follow Jesus. They see what we post online. They see how we treat our friends, our enemies, and strangers. They see how we argue and what we argue about. We have to evaluate and confront these things. The future of Christianity depends on it. Because we could just as easily fall into the same traps as the Israelites. Do Christians chase our desires, our preferences, our value, and whatever idols present themselves? Or do we seek God alone and above all else? Do Christians seek power for our own gain? Or do we remind ourselves that the only authority we have is given from God and is used for God? Do Christians give in to anger and judgment and hatred? Or do we act with kindness, mercy, and humility? Just as the Israelites learned from the previous generations, we as Christians teach the future of Christianity. And we've inherited many, many wonderful things. Our Bible, our many ideas and beliefs, our practices like baptism and communion. And new great things have been added along the way. But it's inevitable that we pick up some bad things too. So let us consider and evaluate the things we have learned so that we might filter out the sins that we inherited and instead pass on only what is good and what is right and what is true and what is pure. God will always bring us back around regardless of our mistakes, as he has shown us time and again throughout the Bible. God's not going anywhere, but we can be better than the Israelites were. Instead of a downward spiral, we can instead be an upward current, carrying the church heavenward like the wings of an eagle. Would you pray with me this morning? Dear Lord, help us to see you. Help us to grow in faith and in strength, in virtue, and in spiritual fruit. Help us to be the people, the generation that you always intended for us to be, for your glory. And help us to pass on your goodness, your mercy, your truth, your kindness, and your love on to the next generation, onto the people who are still seeking, so that from now and forevermore, you might take dominion in this world, and you might bring your kingdom ever closer. For the glory of you, Jesus, we pray this in your name. Amen. Have a good week, everybody.